The maid rescued the billionaire's kidnapped mother. Then the unbelievable happened. Two men in black hoodies dragged an old woman across a rain-soaked alley, and the only person who saw it was the maid he had once accused of stealing. If she screamed for help, they might kill the woman before anyone came. If she stayed silent, she would lose the only family she had left in this city. Her job, her home, her daughter's school. But what didn't make sense was why the kidnappers knew exactly which car to hit, exactly which street was empty, exactly when the security cameras would go dark. The maid gripped a steel pipe with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since she left the mansion that night, while 3 miles away, the billionaire stared at his phone, watching his fiancée lie to a police officer's face. Nobody in that alley knew that the woman being dragged into the rain wasn't just his mother. She was the only person who could prove who had been planning this for months. Welcome back to another story about second chances, hidden truths, and the price people pay for the lies they tell. If you love stories about ordinary people who turn out to be braver than anyone expected, you're in the right place. Where are you watching from tonight? Let us know in the comments, and if you haven't yet, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Naomi Carter had been working at the Ashford estate for 4 months, and in that time she had learned exactly how loud a silent house could be. The mansion sat behind iron gates on the edge of Brookhaven, a neighborhood where the lawns were cut by machines nobody in the houses owned, and the air smelled like money and cut grass. Naomi cleaned bathrooms that were bigger than her apartment. She dusted paintings worth more than she'd make in 10 years. And every single morning, she left her daughter Zuri with Miss Patrice down the hall before the sun came up, because the Ashford house needed her there by 6. She never complained about that. She'd learned a long time ago that complaining didn't pay rent. Daniel Ashford, the man who owned all of it, was 36 years old and had inherited a hotel empire from a father who worked himself into an early grave building it. Daniel wasn't like the stories people told about rich men. He said good morning to Naomi like he meant it. He remembered that her daughter's name was Zuri, not your little girl. Once, when Naomi's car wouldn't start, he'd quietly arranged for a mechanic to come to her apartment, and never mentioned it again. He wasn't perfect. He worked too much, and there were things happening under his own roof that he hadn't yet learned to see. But he was fair. And in Naomi's experience, fair was rare enough to be worth something. Then there was Vivian Cross. Vivian was Daniel's fiancée, and from the moment Naomi met her, something about the woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. Vivian was beautiful in the practiced way. Hair that never moved out of place, dresses tailored to the inch, a laugh she seemed to switch on and off depending on who was watching. In front of Daniel, Vivian was warm. She'd compliment Naomi's work, ask about Zuri, tell Daniel how lucky they were to have someone so reliable in the house. The moment Daniel left the room, the warmth disappeared like a light switched off. "You missed a spot," Vivian said one afternoon, standing in the doorway of the study, watching Naomi polish the same table for the second time that week. "Or maybe you just don't care as much as you pretend to." Naomi kept her eyes on the wood. "I'll take care of it, Miss Cross. See that you do." Vivian's voice had an edge under the sweetness, like a knife wrapped in silk. "Daniel likes to think everyone in this house is trustworthy. I like to make sure that's actually true." It wasn't the words so much as the way Vivian said them, like a warning wearing the costume of a comment. Naomi had seen women like Vivian before, back when she cleaned offices downtown before Zuri was born. Women who smiled at you in front of the boss and made your life difficult when he wasn't looking. She knew the pattern. She just didn't know yet how far Vivian was willing to take it. That first real sign came 3 weeks into Naomi's 5th month. A bracelet went missing from Vivian's dressing room. A thin gold piece with a small sapphire, nothing extravagant by the family's standards, but Vivian made sure everyone in the house heard about it before lunch. "I had it Tuesday night," Vivian told Daniel over dinner, her voice trembling in a way that looked almost convincing. "I know I did. And now it's just gone." Daniel's eyes moved briefly toward the kitchen doorway, where Naomi stood with a tray in her hands, frozen. "I'm not accusing anyone," Vivian added quickly, glancing at Naomi with an expression that suggested the opposite. "I just think it's strange." That night, Naomi searched her own bag twice before she went home, some part of her almost expecting to find the bracelet planted there. She didn't. But the accusation hung over her anyway, the way smoke lingers in a room long after the fire's gone out. Daniel didn't fire her. He didn't even ask her about it directly. But he watched her differently for a few days. Not cold, not cruel, just careful, the way a man watches something he isn't sure of yet. That carefulness hurt more than an accusation would have. 2 days later, the housekeeper found the bracelet in the pocket of one of Vivian's own coats. Vivian laughed it off in front of Daniel. "I'm so scattered, I swear I'd lose my head if it wasn't attached," and the subject was dropped. But Naomi noticed something Daniel didn't. The way Vivian's eyes flicked toward her, just once after the bracelet turned up. Not embarrassed. Not apologetic. Calculating. That night, walking to the bus stop in the cold, Naomi replayed the whole thing in her head. The accusation. Timing. The way Vivian's story had shifted just slightly. First she'd had it Tuesday. Then later she said she couldn't remember exactly when she'd last seen it. Small inconsistencies. The kind most people wouldn't catch. Naomi caught them. She'd spent years learning to read people who held power over her, because her survival had once depended on it. She didn't say anything to Daniel. She had no proof, and a woman like her accusing a woman like Vivian without proof was a fight she'd lose before it started. But she started paying closer attention. To conversations that stopped when she entered a room. To phone calls Vivian took on the balcony, her voice dropping low. To the way Vivian sometimes looked at Daniel. Not with love, but with something closer to ownership. 3 days later, Naomi overheard something she wasn't supposed to hear. Vivian on the phone in the garden. Her voice sharp with irritation. "I told you it has to look like an accident. I don't care how long it takes. I need this handled before the wedding, not after." Naomi stood very still behind the hedge, holding a basket of laundry, her heart pounding. She didn't know what Vivian meant. Not yet. But she knew, with a kind of certainty that settles in your chest like a stone, that something dangerous was already in motion, and that whatever it was, it hadn't started with the bracelet. It had started with something Vivian wanted, badly enough to lie for. And Naomi was standing right in the middle of it. The days after the garden phone call felt different to Naomi, like the air in the house had shifted temperature. She told herself she'd misheard. Maybe Vivian was talking about a business deal, a wedding vendor who was giving her trouble, something ordinary dressed up in dramatic words. People said things like "handle it" and "before the wedding," all the time without meaning anything sinister. But Naomi had learned not to trust the version of events that let her sleep easier. She'd learned that the hard way, a long time before Zuri was born, back when she trusted the wrong man and paid for it with 2 years of her life she couldn't get back. She wasn't going to make that mistake again, not for herself and not for her daughter. So she watched, quietly, carefully, the way she'd learned to watch everything in that house. Daniel's mother, Eleanor Ashford, visited the following week. Eleanor was 71 years old, sharp as a blade despite the soft cardigans and the reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She'd built half of the family's hotel empire alongside her late husband, and she hadn't lost an ounce of the instincts that came with that. From the moment Eleanor walked through the door, Naomi noticed something. The older woman didn't trust Vivian either. "You're new," Eleanor said to Naomi on her first afternoon in the house, studying her with the kind of attention most guests never bothered with. "What's your name?" "Naomi, ma'am." "Naomi." Eleanor nodded slowly, like she was filing the name away somewhere permanent. "You've got good eyes. Watchful. That's rare in this house lately." Naomi didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and Eleanor seemed to appreciate the silence more than she would have appreciated an answer. Over the following days, Naomi noticed Eleanor watching Vivian the same way Naomi had been watching her. Quietly, without confrontation, gathering pieces before saying anything out loud. Twice, Naomi caught Eleanor asking Daniel careful questions about Vivian's family, her past, the friends she claimed to have from her college years. Questions that sounded casual but weren't. "Mother, please," Daniel said one evening, exasperated, as Naomi passed through the hallway with a stack of folded linens. "Vivian's my fiancée. Love her. Can you at least try?" "I am trying," Eleanor said. "That's exactly what I'm doing." Vivian, for her part, played the dutiful future daughter-in-law beautifully in front of Daniel, bringing Eleanor tea, complimenting her dresses, laughing at her old stories about Daniel as a boy. But Naomi watched Vivian's face in the moments when Eleanor wasn't looking, and what she saw there wasn't affection. It was the look of someone calculating how much longer she'd have to perform before the audience left the room. The tension came to a head on a Thursday evening. Eleanor had misplaced her reading glasses, an ordinary, forgettable thing, and mentioned it lightly at dinner. By the next morning, Vivian was telling Daniel, in a hushed and worried voice, that she'd seen Naomi going through Mrs. Ashford's room the day before. It wasn't true. Naomi had cleaned the room as she did every week, in full view of the hallway camera that covered that wing of the house. But Vivian didn't know about the camera, or she'd forgotten it was there, still new, installed only a month earlier after a break-in scare in the neighborhood. Daniel, to his credit, didn't explode. He didn't fire Naomi on the spot, the way another man in his position might have. But he did pull the security footage himself, quietly, before saying anything to anyone. What he found didn't match Vivian's story at all. The footage showed Naomi in Eleanor's room for exactly 6 minutes, cleaning, never once approaching the dresser where the glasses would have been. It also showed something Daniel hadn't been looking for: Vivian entering the same room 20 minutes earlier, alone, opening drawers. Daniel stared at that footage for a long time before he said anything to anyone. He didn't confront Vivian that night. He told himself he needed to think, that there could be an explanation, that jumping to conclusions wasn't fair to the woman he was supposed to marry in 4 months. But something had shifted in him. A small crack in the trust he hadn't questioned before, the kind of crack that doesn't close back up once it opens. Eleanor found her glasses 2 days later, in her own coat pocket, exactly where she'd left them. She apologized for the fuss. But she gave Naomi a long look across the dinner table that evening, one that Naomi understood without a single word being spoken. "I see what's happening here. And I don't think you're the problem." That night, walking home in the dark, Naomi felt something she hadn't let herself feel in weeks. A small, fragile flicker of hope. Someone in that house, someone with actual power, had started to see the truth. But hope, she knew, was dangerous. It made you careless. It made you believe things were getting better right before they got worse. 3 days later they got worse. Naomi arrived at work to find her employment file sitting open on the kitchen counter, papers slightly out of order, as if someone had been searching for something inside it. When she asked the housekeeping supervisor about it, the woman looked uncomfortable and said only that Miss Cross wanted to review the household staff files for wedding planning purposes. It wasn't wedding planning. Naomi knew that immediately. Vivian was building a file on her, looking for something to use. And that same afternoon, Vivian found Naomi alone in the laundry room, and for the first time, she dropped the fake sweetness completely. "You think Eleanor likes you," Vivian said quietly, arms crossed, standing in the doorway like she owned the air in the room, which in a sense she nearly did. "You think that means something, doesn't? Old women like her get sentimental about people like you. It doesn't last." Naomi kept folding the towel in her hands, refusing to let her fingers shake. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Cross." "I mean," Vivian said, stepping closer, her voice dropping into something almost gentle, which made it more frightening, not less. That I built this life. I'm not going to let some maid and a paranoid old woman take it away from me. Whatever you think you saw, whatever you think you know, keep it to yourself. For your daughter's sake. It was the first time Vivian had mentioned Zuri directly. And it landed exactly the way Vivian intended it to. Naomi didn't sleep that night. For the next 2 weeks, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Daniel grew quieter, more watchful, though he never said exactly why. He started asking Naomi small, careful questions. How long she'd worked there, whether she was happy, whether anything unusual had happened that she felt she couldn't mention. Naomi answered honestly but carefully, unwilling to accuse Vivian outright without proof, terrified of what would happen to her and Zuri if she was wrong, or if she was right and it didn't matter. Eleanor, for her part, had started spending more time at the estate than usual, claiming she simply enjoyed being close to her son before the wedding. Naomi suspected the real reason was closer to what it looked like. Eleanor didn't trust Vivian alone in that house, and she wasn't going to give her the chance to prove that instinct right unsupervised. The turning point came on a Friday evening, 3 weeks before the wedding was set to take place. Eleanor had planned to leave the estate that night, driven home by the family's longtime driver, Marcus, a quiet man who'd worked for the Ashfords for over a decade. But at the last minute, Vivian intervened, insisting sweetly that Marcus was needed elsewhere for wedding preparations, and that she'd already arranged a car service to take Eleanor home instead. Daniel, distracted by a work call, didn't think twice about it. Naomi did. She was in the front hallway when the car pulled up, a black sedan, unfamiliar, with a driver Naomi had never seen before, wearing sunglasses despite the fading evening light. Something about it made the back of her neck prickle, though she couldn't have said exactly why. She almost said something. She almost stepped forward and asked Eleanor to wait, to let her call Marcus directly. But Vivian was standing right there, watching her, and Naomi's nerve failed her at the last second. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself rich people used unfamiliar cars all the time. Eleanor got in. The car pulled away. 40 minutes later, Daniel's phone rang. It was Marcus, confused, saying he hadn't been reassigned anywhere, that nobody had told him not to drive Mrs. Ashford home, and that he'd just arrived at the estate to find out she'd already left, in a car he hadn't arranged and didn't recognize. Daniel's face went pale in a way Naomi had never seen before. He called his mother's phone. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. The house exploded into a different kind of tension, not simmering suspicion anymore, but sharp, immediate fear. Daniel called the police. Vivian, to her credit, or perhaps because she had no other choice, played the role of the panicked fiancé perfectly, her hands shaking, her voice cracking as she told the responding officer that she'd simply tried to help by arranging a car service, that she had no idea anything was wrong, that she was just as terrified as everyone else. Naomi stood in the corner of the room, watching Vivian lie to a police officer's face with an ease that made her stomach turn. "What car service did you use?" the officer asked. Vivian hesitated just slightly, just long enough for Naomi to catch it. "I don't remember the name. My assistant arranged it. Can we contact your assistant? She's out of town this week. I'll have to reach her." It was the same pattern Naomi had noticed with the bracelet, weeks earlier. The small inconsistencies, the convenient gaps, the story that shifted just slightly every time someone asked a follow-up question. Daniel noticed it too. Naomi saw it happen, saw the moment something in his expression changed, hardened, the last thread of easy trust finally snapping. He didn't say anything to Vivian in front of the officer, but he looked at her the way a man looks at a stranger wearing a familiar face. 2 hours passed with no word from Eleanor. The police put out an alert. Daniel paced the length of the living room like a man unraveling in real time, his composure cracking with every silent minute. Naomi couldn't stay still either. Something in her, The same instinct that had made the back of her neck prickle when that black sedan pulled away told her this wasn't a random crime. This was planned. And if it was planned, there might be a pattern to it, a location, something Vivian's earlier phone call had hinted at weeks ago without Naomi fully understanding it at the time. I need this handled before the wedding, not after. Naomi's blood went cold. She didn't have proof. She didn't have a badge or an investigation team or the authority to demand anything from anyone in that house. What she had was 4 months of quiet observation, a memory for details most people overlooked, and a growing terrible certainty that she was the only person in that house who understood what was actually happening. She thought about staying silent. It would have been the safe thing to do, the thing that protected her job, her daughter's stability, the fragile normal life she'd built for the two of them. Getting involved in something this dangerous, accusing a woman as powerful and connected as Vivian without proof, could destroy everything Naomi had worked for. But she thought about Eleanor's face across the dinner table, the quiet understanding in the old woman's eyes. I see what's happening here. And I don't think you're the problem. Someone had believed in her when it cost them nothing to look the other way. Naomi approached Daniel that night, her hands shaking, and told him everything. The garden phone call, the file search, the warning in the laundry room. All of it, in a rush, terrified he wouldn't believe her. Terrified it wouldn't matter even if he did. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face unreadable until she finished. Then he said the words that changed everything. "Show me exactly where you were standing when you heard that call." Daniel didn't confront Vivian that night. Instead, he did something Naomi hadn't expected. He asked for her help. Together, working quietly while the police continued their search and Vivian slept, or pretended to, in the guest wing, Daniel and Naomi went through the household security footage from the past month, looking for anything that connected to the mysterious car service, the unfamiliar driver, anything that might explain where Eleanor had been taken. It was Naomi who spotted it first, a detail so small most people would have scrolled right past it. 3 weeks earlier, in footage from the front gate camera, a black sedan matching the one from that evening had idled outside the estate for nearly 20 minutes before driving away. The same driver, the same sunglasses, even though it had been overcast that day. "He was scouting the property," Daniel said quietly, staring at the screen. "This wasn't random. Someone planned this in advance." Naomi nodded, her heart pounding. "And whoever hired him knew the household schedule. Knew when Marcus would normally be here. Knew when he wouldn't be." Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't say Vivian's name out loud, not yet, but Naomi could see the conclusion settling into him like a stone dropping through water. They found something else that night, buried in an old email thread on the shared household computer that Vivian had used months earlier to coordinate wedding vendors. An email, sent to an address neither of them recognized, dated 6 weeks earlier. The subject line was innocuous. Regarding the arrangement. The body of the email had been deleted, but the metadata remained, along with a single forgotten draft that Vivian had apparently started and never sent, then abandoned in the folder. "I need it to look like the family is falling apart on its own. Once his mother is out of the picture and Eleanor's shares transfer to me as executor per the prenup clause, everything else falls into place. Just make sure nothing points back to." The draft ended there, unfinished, unsent, and damning. Daniel read it twice, then a third time, his hands gripping the edge of the desk hard enough that his knuckles went white. "The prenup," he said, almost to himself. "She insisted on that clause. Said it was about protecting my mother's legacy if anything happened to me. I thought it was thoughtful." He let out a short, bitter laugh with no humor in it at all. "It was never about protecting anyone." Naomi said nothing. There was nothing to say that would make this easier for him to hear. But there was still no proof of where Eleanor actually was. No address, no name for the driver, nothing that pointed to an active location. The draft email proved motive. It didn't prove where his mother was being held, or whether she was even still safe. It was nearly midnight when Naomi remembered something small, something she almost hadn't mentioned because it had seemed insignificant at the time. Weeks earlier, cleaning the garden shed, she'd found a folded paper receipt for a storage facility, tucked behind a shelf, the kind of thing that could have belonged to anyone on the household staff and meant nothing on its own. Except the name on the receipt wasn't a staff member's. It was a name Naomi recognized from Vivian's phone contacts, glimpsed once months earlier, when Vivian had left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. A name Vivian had once introduced, briefly and dismissively, as an old family friend helping with wedding logistics. Daniel pulled up the storage facility's address in seconds. It was 20 minutes away, in an industrial stretch on the edge of the city, the kind of place with more empty units than active ones, exactly the sort of location someone would choose if they needed somewhere quiet, forgettable, and far from prying eyes. Daniel wanted to call the police immediately, and he did. But detectives explained it would take time to secure a warrant based on a receipt and an unsent email draft, time they might not have if Eleanor was truly in danger. Daniel, frantic, started for the door himself. It was Naomi who stopped him. "You go and you get seen, and whoever's watching this place panics," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I clean industrial units for a supplemental job on weekends. Nobody looks twice at a woman in a work uniform pulling into a storage facility at night. You'll get 5 minutes before someone realizes something's wrong. I might get 20. Daniel stared at her, torn between fear for his mother and fear of putting Naomi in danger too. "Naomi, if something happens to you, then call the police the second I don't check in," Naomi said. "I'm not asking you to let me be a hero. I'm asking you to let me buy your mother some time while the people with badges catch up." She grabbed her old work jacket from the hallway closet, and a steel pipe from the garage that she told herself was just for confidence, and got into her car before Daniel could argue further, his voice calling after her fading into the cold night air. She drove into the dark not knowing exactly what she'd find, only knowing that somewhere in that storage facility, an old woman who had once looked at her with kindness across a dinner table might be running out of time, and that for once in her life, Naomi wasn't going to stand quietly in the corner while someone else decided what happened next. The storage facility was exactly as forgettable as Naomi had imagined. Rows of corrugated metal doors under flickering security lights, rain starting to fall in a thin, cold drizzle that made everything glisten under the sodium lamps. She parked 2 rows away from the address on the receipt, cut her headlights, and walked the rest of the way on foot, her uniform jacket pulled tight, the steel pipe hidden along her forearm beneath her sleeve. She heard Eleanor before she saw her, a muffled, furious voice arguing with someone, refusing to be quiet even in a situation that would have silenced most people twice her age. It was, Naomi thought later, the single detail that saved all of their lives. Eleanor Ashford was far too stubborn to be an easy hostage. 2 men in dark hoodies were pulling Eleanor toward a car parked in the alley behind the units. Her wrists bound loosely with rope, her purple evening dress soaked through and torn at the hem where she'd clearly been fighting them the entire way. She was 71 years old, and she was still fighting. Naomi didn't think. She acted. She screamed, not in fear, but as a weapon, loud enough to echo off the metal walls, loud enough to make both men flinch and turn. In the half-second of confusion that followed, she swung the steel pipe hard enough to connect with the nearest man's shoulder, sending him stumbling into the wet pavement. "Let her go!" Naomi's voice tore out of her, raw and furious, years of swallowed anger finally finding somewhere to land. "Let her go right now." The second man lunged toward her, and for one terrifying second Naomi thought this was how it ended. In a rain-soaked alley, over a woman she'd known for less than 2 months, for a family that wasn't even hers. But Eleanor, freed for a moment as her captor turned toward Naomi, drove her elbow backward into the first man's ribs with surprising force, breaking loose enough to stumble toward the wall, screaming for help at the top of her lungs. The commotion, the screaming, the flickering security lights, a nearby dog barking wildly, was enough. Somewhere down the row of units, Another driver making a late-night storage run heard the noise and called out, headlights swinging toward the alley. The two men, unwilling to risk being seen clearly, released their grip and ran, disappearing into a side street before Naomi could get a good look at either of their faces. Naomi dropped the pipe and rushed to Eleanor, catching the older woman as her knees buckled from adrenaline and exhaustion. "I've got you," Naomi said, her own hands shaking violently now that the danger had passed. "I've got you, you're safe." Eleanor gripped Naomi's arm hard enough to bruise, staring at her with an expression somewhere between shock and fierce, unshakable gratitude. "You came," she said, breathless. "You actually came." "Of course I came," Naomi said, and meant it more than she'd ever meant anything. Police arrived 12 minutes later, followed almost immediately by Daniel, who ran across the wet pavement and pulled his mother into his arms with a sound that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite relief, something rawer than either. The investigation that followed moved quickly once detectives had a real trail to follow. The storage unit, once searched, contained more than just evidence of the kidnapping. Financial records, burner phones, and correspondence tying Vivian Cross directly to the two men hired to stage what was meant to look like a random robbery gone wrong. The prenuptial agreement, once reviewed by Daniel's lawyers with fresh eyes, revealed an executor clause quietly inserted months earlier that would have handed Vivian significant control over Eleanor's shares in the family company had Eleanor been declared incapacitated, or worse, before the wedding. It hadn't been about love. It had never been about love. It had been about money, control, and a woman who'd built her entire relationship with Daniel Ashford on a foundation designed to be profitable long before it was ever meant to be permanent. Vivian was arrested 2 days later, her composure finally, completely gone, replaced by a cold fury aimed at everyone but herself. She tried in her final conversation with Daniel to explain it away, to call it a misunderstanding, to insist she'd only meant to scare Eleanor, never truly harm her. Daniel didn't argue with her. He simply looked at her the way you look at a stranger you're relieved to finally see clearly, and walked out of the room without another word. Naomi kept her job, though kept felt like the wrong word for what actually happened. Eleanor insisted, over Daniel's own suggestion of a modest bonus, that Naomi be given a permanent position managing household operations, with a salary that finally matched the courage she'd shown and the care she'd given long before anyone in that house had earned it. It wasn't charity. Eleanor made that clear more than once. It was recognition long overdue. Zuri, 3 years old and utterly unaware of how close her mother had come to losing everything, started attending a better preschool 3 weeks later, one Naomi could suddenly afford without stretching every dollar until it nearly snapped. On her first day, she looked up at Naomi with wide, curious eyes and asked why her mommy kept crying happy tears in the car, and Naomi laughed and hugged her daughter and didn't have an answer that a 3-year-old could understand, only one she understood completely herself. Months later, at Eleanor's insistence, Naomi stood at the edge of a small, quiet gathering at the estate. Not a wedding, not yet, but a celebration of Eleanor's recovery and the family's reprieve, and watched Daniel raise a glass in a toast that mentioned her name directly, calling her in front of everyone. "The reason my mother is still here, and the reason I finally understood what real character looks like." Naomi didn't need the toast. She'd never needed anyone's permission to know her own worth. But it was nice for once to be seen, fully honestly without suspicion, in a house that had once made her feel like she had to prove she belonged there. She'd walked into that alley not knowing if she'd walk back out. She'd walked out with her dignity, her daughter's future secured, and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that doing the right thing, even when it terrified her, had been worth every second of fear. If you were in her position, watching something you couldn't prove, risking everything you had left, would you have stayed silent or would you have found the courage to act? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If it moved you, let us know in the comments, and subscribe if you'd like more stories about courage, truth, and the people who refuse to stay silent. We'll see you in the next one.